So my research and my writing and teaching, being in the area of kind of psychoanalysis, let's just say, and religion and culture and social theory, what I find really helpful is to, especially when I'm teaching or if I'm writing, to show the students, show the reader how a particular concept, idea, actually looks in the real world. In other words, so say I'm talking to a class about racism, let's just say, and I'm talking about the psychodynamics of racism. So the idea that the individual mind is not just an individual mind, it's a social mind. And that's one of the things I'm very interested in, is the way in which society that we're born into, the social institutions and so on, the way in which they shape and form our values, our ways of thinking, attitudes, without us even giving it a second thought, right? So if I'm talking about that, I may, for example, use a concept called projective identification, which is not very well understood popularly, but it's a pretty complex idea. Essentially, one of the components, I think, or one way of understanding, say, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, any of those prejudices, is what is the psychological work that it's doing for the person who holds those ideas. And one way of looking at it is that there are certain, let's just say, certain things going on in the unconscious about the person and the way they feel about themselves that would be too unbearable if it were brought to consciousness. So then the person may engage in a certain process of splitting and projection and identification, because let's just say the unthinkable, the unbearable parts of the self, it's parts of the self. So if you annihilate them, you lose a part of yourself. So how do you preserve it, but then also exonerate yourself from having it or having to face it? You evacuate that part of yourself. You project it on others and others. And that's not me, but also it's a way of keeping that part of yourself close, right? So when you look at it that way, I want the students to expand their thinking beyond moralizing and beyond ideologies. Because if we can expand our way of thinking in that way, then we also see how we ourselves, how these attitudes are to be understood in terms of human psychological capacities that we need to look at, right? That we have to think about, we're not pure, or we're all, even if we're completely lovely and not racist and whatever, these are capacities. They do psychological work for us. They help us navigate the world in ways that we should be able to navigate differently, but we can't for whatever reasons, to do with upbringing, etc. So that's how I try to bring this idea of the individual and the social mind to work, so they actually get to see how this might work in a human life, for example. Or if we're talking about trauma, and the impact of trauma on a life. And today, in fact, in class, a question came up about parents and the role of parents, and how difficult it is, even though say, your parents' ideas, you can't accept them, but they're really hard to reject. And what's that about? So we sort of talk about the ways in which, the internalizations and identifications with parental figures, when you turn your back on certain values that they have, at lower, more primal levels, can also feel like an abandonment, an annihilation. And that, of course, brings up guilt. And so this is the kind of thing I try to do, so that students will get a sense of the ways in which human minds, are implicated in and create their worlds. And they find that really helpful. because part of it is I try to appeal to the students' empathic imagination, right? So say I'm teaching one case I really like to teach is a case of spirit possession. I think I mentioned this to you. Her name was Alice Nona, 1970, when it used to be Ceylon. And this woman being possessed by her dead father and all this kind of stuff. So what I try to do with the students is I try to bring out as much as possible this woman's humanness so that they can see what this woman went through in terms of domestic violence, in terms of loss, in terms of abandonment, the way in which she was humiliated and kind of excluded from her larger family, being blamed for things beyond her control, like the fact that her mother died when she was little, for example. So all of these sorts of things, and then the ways in which she was able to find a culturally existent idiom to express her internal pain, but in ways that the community could understand. So when she talked about being possessed by a spirit, it allowed her to do a number of things, to possess her pain, but also to call, for example, her husband to account about transgressions he'd committed that she couldn't say in a non-possessed state, right? So that's a part of her. So, and then the ways in which, healing processes can occur when somebody is able to find a way not only to speak their internal world, but to be heard. And for people to say, yeah, I understand that. I get that. Differently than the way we do, but it's a similar kind of a process, right? So I try to encourage the students to, back over decades of time in a completely different culture than, although not now anymore, a lot of people would come from those parts of the world. So if they can establish that sort of empathic, imaginative connection with another person, then that opens up ways of talking about difference without falling into colonialist narratives, pathologizing narratives. Well, this is a case of multiple personality. Well, yeah, but what does that do? Like, okay, where does that get you? Sort of thing. So I think, from what they tell me, that really captures their imagination, because they can start without appropriating in an obnoxious colonialist way. They can start to say, yeah, this is a person. It's not my experience. This is a person. This is a human being, right? So, and then the theories, I kind of marshal the theories in that way around that sort of nucleus.